Great. So here we are at the beginning of our book group for the spring into the summer. And this time we're looking at Thomas Merton, Seeds of Contemplation. So we move from the medieval world through Trees of Avila, and now we're coming into the modern, which is very exciting. So as usual, I want to just this week ponder for a moment with my English hat on, what is it that we're reading? It's always really helpful just to sort of at the beginning of the book, kind of just sort of go, well, what are we reading and what are expectations? And then it helps to guide us in how we read, but also what we can get out of a text and also how we can be attentive to it. So what are we reading? What kind of a book is this Seeds of Contemplation? Well, Merton says right at the beginning of his little preface, this is the kind of book that writes itself almost automatically in a monastery. So in a sense, it's much more a collation, a collection of thoughts, of his thoughts about the spiritual life, and also probably his thoughts that coming out of experience that he's having as a Cistercian monk at the time, because that's when it was written. So though the writings have been structured into chapters with different headings, in fact, they're not in sequence to each other. So we're not going to progress through a book like we do with others. So with the Scale of Perfection and also with Trees of Avila, there's not a sequential, sort of journey. Instead, these are little sort of pockets of writing, essays of writing that have been done at separate times, and they've been all brought together. So if you think of them, that they're like on different bits of paper, and they've all been brought together, and they've all been given a heading, and they've been brought into a chapter. Now, Merton may very well have decided what is the, how are those writings going to sit next to each other? So there may be a bit of loose talking of one to the other, but we're not to expect that we're going on a journey now. So hence, it's a book that you can read from cover to cover, as we're going to do, or it's one which you can dip into. So you can just say, oh, I want to read that one today, depending on what draws your eye. And I think that's quite nice as a devotional book, because it means that you could get an idea of what it's like, by reading it in one go together. And then you can go back to the different sections and say, actually, I want to ponder that one a bit more. And it's not like you've got to rewind the tape or something. You can actually dive straight in. So it can be used as a dip in and dip out of book. This means that each chapter is complete in itself. And so in many ways, it's worth pondering just on its own. So this book group is going to give us more of an overall feel, but there are gems, as I say, that it holds, which you can go back to and contemplate. So Merton tells us very clearly that he's not making this stuff up. He is standing on the shoulders of giants. He is following a very clear tradition. And in a sense, this book group, from its first time it started, the kind of books it's been looking at have been all of this kind of genre. So he's continuing that sort of genre But he tells us that the tradition he's particularly drawing on is that of the Cistercian writers. And of course, the big Cistercian writer is Bernard of Clairvaux in the medieval period. And of course, because he's a Cistercian and Bernard was seminal in actually shaping what the Cistercian order spirituality looked like. But he's also drawing on St. John of the Cross for his guidelines. And also there's some of Benedict in there, the rule of Benedict. So this is where he's getting his notion of contemplative prayer really out of the Spanish mystics. And those of you with us last time, one before one, the Teresa of Avila, will already have got a real feel for Teresa and that Carmelite spirituality and her notion of the interior castle. And what it is like, what contemplation means for her. So Merton is writing out of that. He's not saying it's original, but I would say that he is revisioning the ancient wisdom of the past for a more modern time. So Merton himself tells us that it's not a created book. It's not a book made of art in the sense of a work of art. So if you think comparing this with Teresa, it's a book which, just like Teresa, it's a book which is written out of prayer in communion with God. And in whose presence it was written, he said. The text is therefore an act of prayer and comes out of a time of praying and contemplative silence of his own. It's not about him at all, and it's not about creating a structured work of art which is then relayed to an audience. That's very different. He's writing more like a spiritual journal. And actually, I've got to get her in, haven't I? And actually, Julian of Norwich her writings have now been seen as being written in a similar way, writing out of prayer to understand her experiences. And maybe Merton similarly is doing that. He's writing to really understand for him what's the spiritual life is, what it is, what it isn't, and how it is developing within him. Now, some of you have already discovered that it does have a complex publication history. The text was first published in 1949, and it was called Seeds of Contemplation. And the difference being about that text is that it was written without any clear notion of an audience, but it really was written in a monastery, in isolation, a person writing for themselves. He says the author was alone with his own experience of contemplative life. So it's written out of that. It was very popular, and I think Merton was probably a bit surprised that it was so popular. So 12 years later, I'm sure he went back to it and he went, oh, I can't believe I wrote that. You know, most people do, don't they? So he went back to it 12 years later, and he decided that it needed to be updated and it needed to be revised as a result of not only his deeper wisdom of the contemplative life, but his interaction with other Cistercians, other people who are living the spiritual life, but also with more of an external audience. And it must be said, his deep interest in other faiths. So the second book, the revision, is directed more to a general audience. And I would say that the original book is writing more for self-understanding, and the later book is for an audience, written for an audience. And of course, that changes the way you sort of write things, because when you're writing it for yourself, you're much freer. When you're writing it for a general audience, you have to be more careful about how you word things so that you won't be misunderstood. And he tells us that nearly every chapter was changed and extended and had bits added to, and there are whole chapters that are also added into the text. So this new updated version was published in 1962, and it was called New Seeds of Contemplation. And this is the version that we're reading, New Seeds of Contemplation. Now, the first publication is out of print, and this is where the confusion comes in, because when it was a later edition of it, 1972, which is really quite accessible and used a lot, Thomas Merton asked for the word new to be dropped. And little did he know, probably, just how accessible out-of-date publications would become, but also how expensive they can be. So that's where we get the confusion that this new Seeds of Contemplation has this dual sort of title. But the key thing to look for is what was the publication date. And it's the 1962 edition, not the 1949. So one of the aspects of the original work that Merton really wrestled with, and I think wanted to clarify the most, was this tricky word. Once again, we come back to it, which is contemplation. And it's really interesting, isn't it? Those of you who've belonged to this book club for a while will notice that that word keeps changing its meaning, and it's quite tricky to actually know what it does mean at all, really. And it's something that we've had to think through each time. What is it meaning in this context? Because it means different at different periods and for different writers. But in the preface, Thomas Merton, he tells us that he really did have concerns with the use of this word, and he was tempted to actually drop the use of the word. Now, his concerns are really helpful, actually. He was concerned that it could be misleading, raising hopes that were just not real, that it can be seen as a kind of magical word, an inspirational one, or even an aspirational term. So something that we can kind of procure for ourselves, something that actually we can work out and get to, like a success criteria. And also this idea that, well, once we've got the contemplative life, all our troubles will go away. That is a bit of a panacea for the woes of this world. And these were the things that Merton, it troubled Merton most, is that it's quite easy to read that into the term. And he was so concerned that he wanted to actually, as I say, he wanted to drop the word. he was also concerned that the original text was seen as a text which was teaching someone how to become a contemplative. And of course, contemplation, the contemplative life can't be taught. It can't be acquired. It's not a product. It can't be bought. It doesn't matter how much praying you do. It can't just be something that you can get for yourself. And he was worried that that's exactly what it seemed to be that his first text was giving the impression of. So in this new Seeds of Contemplation, the first two chapters in this edition, new edition, he gives some clarity on the term. And in a sense, those are the two chapters that make up half of what we're looking at this evening. And I think they're really helpful, and I hope you'll be able to have a good discussion about them. The first chapter I found quite difficult to read, but I found it very helpful when he said what contemplation is not. It's often the way, isn't it? So I hope that you'll be able to have a good conversation about that tonight. And for those of you who are not staying for the breakout rooms, I hope that the questions to ponder for you will give you an opportunity to find a bit of time to just think about what does contemplation mean for you, and what does it not mean for you, and how has that changed? So I'm going to stop recording now and put you into breakout rooms. Those of you, as I say, who are leaving at this point, farewell. It's lovely having you with us, and we meet again next week, same time, same place, for the next four chapters. So I will turn off the recording